slightly unimaginatively titled by myself, Storytelling or Stories and Modern Indian Literatures. And there are three participants. I'm the moderator, and the three participants, one of whom hasn't turned up yet. So, which means there are two participants, which is great. Udaya Kumar and Saikat Majumdar. Please come up. Yeah. I'm hoping that Asad Zaidi will turn up, maybe not after the session, but as it progresses. Yeah, maybe I should move on. So although we're debunking storytelling on the grounds of debunking community and communal harmony, we still should show kind of some togetherness, I suppose, in this on this platform. Both Uday and Saikat are friends of mine, so which is my excuse for not having prepared any notes for questions. I'm going to just pretend this is a conversation we are having, where I'm going to ask them about what I know they know and what I'm curious about in terms of what they know. The prefatory remarks to be made about this particular session is that one of the things that storytelling is identified with, and one of the things that privileges storytelling after its emergence into kind of the forefront of our kitsch literary imagination in the last 25 years, where we have all become storytellers, is its identification with non-Western cultures, and part of its kind of identification via non-Western cultures with orality, and the privileging of orality and literary sort of expressions which bear the mark of the oral, and thereby of a new status for verbosity and prolixity, used not as pejoratives but as terms of praise, where in fact the terms of praise become overturned, and compression and evasion and elision are seen to be marks of inscribed or written works, which are Western or bourgeois or suspect for one reason or another. If elision and compression and indirectness are a part of the inscribed text, if the inscribed text and also poetry as it is inscribed forces us to stop as we read, that is, individual words force us to stop. A blank space between one section and another, or a blank visual space between one verse and another, is indicative of the importance of silence. Then we have moved away from that into this other space which identifies orality, of course, with its source, which is speech, but also with uninterrupted, non-silent, non-arrested, a non-arrested flow, where there is no reason for that, for those arrests, and privileges that, and also makes it identical with a particular kind of cultural formation, the cultural formation of the non-West. To me, this is kind of, it doesn't ring true with what I know of cultures outside of the West. Certainly doesn't ring true of Indian cultures, whether they are classical Indian cultures or modern Indian cultures, where the gestural and the synecdochal are such important ways even of relating epic. So one of the things that happens is that in our privileging of a particular cultural formation and identifying a particular mode of address or expression with that cultural formation, we also begin to give it names like epic, for instance. We use epic as a kind of shorthand without actually looking at what that term means. And the fact that in our culture, epic is often narrated by gesture. And one thinks of dance, one of the main sort of avenues, rather than storytellers sitting around the street telling us various kind of episodes and not stopping. That only happens in our consciousness, in our dreams, or of what an authentically Indian storytelling kind of ethos might be like. Our actuality of meeting up with these epics, besides their kitsch versions on television, are the wonderful gestural versions we encounter in dance, for instance. And there are many other modern reworkings of epic as well, which are contrarian and ambivalent. The role of compression and synecdoche and elision and economy are extremely important in Indian writing, whether it's Tagore looking at these qualities in Kalidas, or whether it's in Tagore himself or in other writers after him. So this is what I feel, but I may be wrong about this. So which is why I have Udaya Kumar and Saikat Majumdar here. Udaya's first book was on James Joyce, very well-regarded study, which he did as a DPhil student at Oxford, and kind of seen to be a unique work, bringing Deleuze, was it? Into his critical study, and then he went on to think and write about Malayalam literature, and when was it that your book? Is it in the first person? Is that what it's
writing the first person?
Writing the first person. When did that? Was it?
2016.
It came out in 2016 from OUP. Was it? Permanent Black. Only a friend can forgive all these sort of fumblings. But anyway, but I've got the essential message out that we're looking at a man who's written about, I think, what I'm interested in any writing, and these residues or traditions of modernism and the avant-garde. One is not interested in Indian literature because it is immemorial or authentic in some way, but because it's made certain departures. And these are departures we almost know next to nothing about, because again, we disavow modernity and we disavow modernism when it comes to when we set the terms of talking about India and its cultures. So storytelling is one form of that disavowal. Saikat Majumdar has also written an academic study, but I think with the agenda also of his particular own predilections as a writer, or at least the kind of writer he was when he wrote that study, which is a study called Prose of the World, where he writes about modernism and modernist writers. But he is also a novelist. So Saikat will be speaking also as somebody who himself is engaged in creative practice. I'm going to ask him about Bengali literature and his experience of storytelling in Bengali literature. Uday, so I want to ask you about your response to my opening remarks and how they relate to your experience of Malayalam literature, and whether that experience was a given or whether you had to find a language for what you were encountering there in terms of non-storytelling, if that was the case. Or did you, or were all your kind of expectations of storytelling that come to us from what to expect from Indian culture confirmed by what you found in Malayalam literature? If there weren't, then did you have to find a language to address it?
Yeah. Thank you, Amit, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And I really enjoyed listening to the lecture in the morning. The half which I got to listen to. See, I feel that there are two different kinds of issues. One is when we talk about the Eastern and the Western, or the Indian and the Western. One is this whole question of orality, which Amit highlighted. And the second is the question of narrativity. Now, it's not essentially the case that all narratives are more elaborated, or the elaborate forms which are not really cryptic or which do not have elision are of a narrative kind. Because in both these cultures, whether it be Western or Eastern cultures or non-Western cultures, which we shouldn't put in the same basket anyway, there would be a large number of forms which are recursive or acclamatory, or in the Indian context, forms of chanting, which are non-narrative forms. They're not narrative at all. But at the same time, they work with elaborations of various kinds. They do not work with elision necessarily. Yeah? Now, the question about, Amit posed about my own work, in some sense it's relevant, so I would comment on it. Like when I was working on Joyce, it's not very surprising, on many occasions you are learning to read a novel like a poem. Yeah? There are many parts of the novel which, or probably the entire novel, which at some level also demands to be read as a poem, where you're actually breaking down passages, training your eye on particular connections which go across the book. In Joyce's case, in particular, in Ulysses, about 2/3 of the way down the composition of the novel, at one point he began inserting phrases from the later chapters into the earlier chapters, for instance. So you get these patterns of repetition which come up, which go against the grain of narrative continuity. They interrupt that, and they kind of bring to the surface something of the order of textual connections which are not narrative connections. Yeah. So, but interestingly, over the past years, when I have been working on writings from Kerala, writings in Malayalam, especially from the late 19th century onwards, when you begin to get the modern prose forms, once again I found that if one wishes to see what is actually really happening with the appearance of these texts in the public domain or in the place that we call Kerala, what kind of event are these texts, so to say? Yeah? Then one has to kind of, again, interrupt the assumption that these are novels and these are forms of narrative cohesion. One has to kind of slice into that and see some other kinds of principles of rupture or cohesion which operate. Yeah? So in both these cases, I feel that reading texts which announce themselves as narratives against the grain of narrative is very important. And now I would like to make a quick comment on why I think that is the case. Yeah? We are living in a teaching and literature department. Probably Saikat would share my views. There are dominant ways of reading which are very heavily focused on the idea of narrative. Like whether we see a text is politically progressive or conservative, as something which is exclusionary or inclusive. Many of these things are debated on the basis of some kind of interpretation of narrative structures. Yeah? And probably the philosophical reason behind this is that often it is taken for granted that narrative is actually in some sense the natural script in which agency expresses itself. That is, insofar as we have purposive activity on the part of human beings, the form in which they need to be represented is that of a narrative. Yeah? So, however, see, Amit's concept note actually highlighted the question of the event, which can be opposed to the idea of narrative. The event probably shows you a different kind of implication of questions of agency. And on the other hand, you may also have something at the opposite end of the spectrum from the event, something like habit, where the subject is actually not agentive in a clear or direct sense of the term, but the experiences are in the order of passivity of some kind. Yeah, the subject's experience of life or positioning in the world may not allow itself to be understood in agentive terms. In such situations, narrative in the simple sense in which we often understand the term is inadequate as a lens for looking at them. So there in particular, we have to look at non-narrative connections or non-narrative textures which are operating even within texts which announce themselves as narratives. I'll give one small example and then I'll stop for the time being. At one point I was trying to look at some of these autobiographies written by Dalit writers, partly because many of these texts have become part of literature curricula in various Indian universities. And there is a real challenge about how do you actually bring something like Dalit writing, which has a very strong vernacular force, into the English classroom. Yeah? And what kind of tools do you need to even approach them? Yeah? Even to recognize the difficulty of their placement within the curriculum or the classroom. Yeah? So one thing which I felt when I was working on some of those texts is really that narrativist ways of interpreting them do not really allow us to account for the force of these texts. Yeah? Because most of these are texts about suffering of various kinds, caste oppression, then a period of struggle which goes on against it. And it's not like the struggle is over by the time the book is composed, but the fact that the subject has come to the point where he or she is able to write a book, tell one's own story, is itself seen as some kind of point of arrival or tentative arrival or a different stage in the struggle, so to say. Yeah? So in this sense, you could say if you look at the narrative structure in a simple sense, or plot structures of these narratives, they are of course agentive narratives. They are agentive narratives of progressive expression and attainment of agency, you could say. However, this kind of reading does not allow you to see the force of these autobiographies. Why is it that these autobiographies create a kind of special effect or special impact on the language of selfhood or the language of experience or even within the commonly accepted protocols of the public domain? So there we may find that often the force of these narratives actually come from moments which probably are kind of left behind in the course of the narrative progress, but moments precisely of the kind of things which were hinted at in the lecture in the morning, not really embarrassment as much as instances of shame or instances of humiliation, forced experiences of shame. Let's say, in terms of effect, probably there are strong connections between what one feels in situations of humiliation and what one feels in situations of shame. Now, the interesting point about these effects is that they do not allow themselves to occupy the form of narration. Not because they are events which are too traumatic to narrate, but the structure of subjectivity in these experiences is actually not amenable to narration. Like in the case of shame, there have been some very interesting philosophical discussions on this. In Levinas, for example, in Agamben, for instance, you have this argument that the subject really finds itself unable to inhabit its body, inhabit its identity, and at the same time finds it equally difficult to escape from oneself. Yeah? So it is in that torsion that you get this experience of shame or humiliation. Now, these kinds of figures of the subjectivity are very different from figures of agentive subjectivity that we are familiar with. And so I tend to think that in texts like this, the apparent structure of narration is more like a prop which allows you to stage something else. and that what is being staged is not really a narrative entity. So this is the
Sure.
point.
Okay, great. I have. I want to ask 3 questions which have come into my head to both of you, and to you both as somebody who's going to speak about Bengali modernity, because that at the moment you talk about Bengali literature, that is what you're talking about, but also your own writing. But I want to begin by asking this of you, and then just remember the questions, because I will have forgotten them by the time. So the first question is your comment about reading Joyce in the way that one would read poetry, rather than narrative. This I want to relate to the fact that within India, reading a poem as a poem, or a narrative as a poem, whatever that might mean, and the language necessary for it, has been made secondary to the demands of reading works in a way that is related to readings engendered by the social sciences. The centrality of the social sciences as an academic and intellectual discourse in India, and its relation to the existence of something that demands to be read through another language all around us. How do we read so much that is around us that demands to be read as a poem, as you put it, when the social sciences imposes a kind of narrativity, a narrative? That is the first question. The second one is, yes, of course, we cannot say that all interruptions in narrative, say written by an Irish writer or a Malayalam writer or a Bengali writer, necessarily have to do with compression or elision or silence. They might have to do with interruptions of other kinds that have to do with performance, for instance, and a kind of exhibitionism, a kind of even melodrama. The person who comes to mind in cinema in this regard is Hrithik Ghatak. Hrithik Ghatak immediately then begins to be read as more authentically Indian because of these these characteristics, say in opposition to Ray, where the interruptions have to do with elision and silence in his cinema. However, actually look at Hrithik Ghatak, we find that Hrithik Ghatak is staging performance, and he's also incorporating elision. So in the same text is, you find that elision, compression, poetry is not incompatible in the works of these people with performance and melodrama. They're not two separate spaces in Hrithik Ghatak. That's the second thing. And the third thing had to do with autobiography, which I know you're very interested in, Udaya, and I think you too, Saikat, as a reader but also as a writer. Autobiography is in this, again, in this ambiguous domain. On the one hand, it is my story. I'm telling you my story. Then in that case, I'm engaging in storytelling of a very fundamental kind. And then maybe I have a very important story to tell. And we know all about that particular, often either politicized or, more importantly, commercialized form of autobiography, or the idea of autobiography. On the other hand, we have, say, Naipaul's rejection, and then a host of other writers who have very different political affinities from Naipaul, of what he calls the well-made story. And the one way of unshackling himself from the well-made story is to go into this diffuse area, which, if we lack a word to describe it, might be called autobiography, but which is actually exploring the unshackling of form, something like Enigma of Arrival. So he's left aside the well-made story. He's left aside the pretense of telling a story about imaginary characters. He's telling you about somebody very like himself, and he's leaving that open. And there's an unshackling going on, which is why I suppose also Derrida, when speaking to Derek Attridge, says, yes, maybe the only form of creative writing possible now is autobiography. I'm presuming it has to do with this, not because he wants to tell a story, or he wants to validate or legitimize a story, but because of his interest in this unshackling from the well-made, or from the construct. So I would like you to sort of respond to this, Uday, and then Saikat, in relation to your readings as critics and as writers as well.
Yeah, thank you, Amit. Yeah, of course, it's true that social scientific use of literary texts have kind of privileged the narrative structures, and also an attempt to understand these narrative structures is giving you access to a certain moment in social history or historical consciousness or things of that kind. But sometimes what we broadly call social scientific writing can really be highly sophisticated and highly creative. Like, for example, in Sudipto Kaviraj's writing on Tagore, for instance, and Tagore and Bankim, about how the idea of beauty changes, or how faces are described in novels, and these are not narrativistic readings at all, because you're actually extracting these moments from different novels, and you're looking at the way descriptions operate or language operates. And in fact, when I was beginning to teach in the university, and in 1980s and even 90s, I used to feel that the social science writing on Indian novels was a lot better than what was happening in the literature departments. Yeah? Because literature departments were actually academic departments. I'm not speaking about literary criticism as it is practiced in the outside the university in the broader public domain, but within the literature departments, especially the work on Indian literature as well as Indian English writing, etc., it used to be dominated by ideas of literature which arguably come from the first half of the 20th century. And traditionally you would have questions on character, plot, style, etc., as essential elements of reading the novel. Now, social scientific writing was free from this. This we have to understand. And there is, in some sense, there is also a kind of shaking up of the text, which makes available various components for examination, in a way in which literature professors were unable to do that in the classrooms at that time. But having said this, I would say that beneath the kind of problem that Amit was trying to indicate, is the problem which I tried to formulate in my first response as thinking about narratives as having a kind of intimate relationship with agency. That is, I think, the conceptual connection. And that connection manifests itself in the form of what people used to call vulgar sociologisms of various kinds. It can come up in social history writing, it can come up in literary criticism, but what we need to kind of unpack probably is that connection between agency and narrative, and think about other configurations of subjectivity which cannot be understood in terms of a rather simple notion of agency. And agency is seen as some kind of fulfillment of the subject, etc., etc. So that's by way of a comment on the first question. And now I am not suggesting that all non-narrativist readings should take the form of reading texts like poetry. Poetry is not the only non-narrative form that we have to understand. Like, for example, in the novel, for instance, Sambudha is aware of this. When we look at the early novels in India, a lot of the time, the novel is actually a space for various kinds of presentation, various kinds of demonstration, display. And some of it might be about new objects which are coming into circulation. There is a Malayalam novel in which one chapter begins with a character asking another character a question, do you know anything about the new marriage regulation? And the other character replies, yes, there are 13 important points in that, and then you have 13 paragraphs listing them. That is the end of the chapter. Yeah? And also public discourses of various kinds. In political novels, there is a kind of demonstrative writing, like a description of torture methods. Now, this may not have any kind of what we call organic relationship in literary criticism to the plot structures of the novel, but the plot is there in order for this to happen, to present this. So there are forms of exteriority of this kind which are directly presented within that frame of what we call a narrative text. So this is again a non-narrative dimension of narrative text. But more importantly, there is also the question of displacements. Now, it's not merely about silences and elisions, but the narrative structure which is actually presented, the story which is presented, may itself be a screen which is displacing something else. Yeah? Now, after psychoanalysis, we are familiar with this kind of structure of appearance. Yeah? Some of the historical novels which I had an opportunity to work with, some of the complex historical novels, often you find an attempt to present an acclamatory narrative about the past, but that acclamatory narrative itself may be suffused with a tone of mourning, which you cannot find where it is coming from, because there is no narrative justification for that. The plot is actually one of victory, one of celebration, one of acclamation. But if you follow that strand of mourning, you may actually find that there are elements which are operating within the text which are kind of coming up to the surface, and in order to prevent them from coming, there is the narrative structure or screen which seems to operate. So the good story, Coetzee's idea of the good story or the well-made story itself may actually be a screen. Sometimes the well-made story offered in an autobiography may be a screen. How do you know this is a screen? There one may want to make a distinction between narration in the case of autobiography and instances of or some kind of insight into inhabitation. That is, you have a narrative which is about your life story. That may be the apparent level of many of the more traditional autobiographies written in India in the 19th and 20th centuries. You may not find too many personal experiences being narrated. You may not find anything about one's emotional life or erotic life. Sometimes your spouse's name itself doesn't figure in the entire narrative. But in these narratives, you may find that there are moments of unease or slippage or elision, which may actually open the way to some more problematic moment, where there is unease, embarrassment about inhabiting a particular figure which you are putting forward. So I tend to think that the well-made story cannot automatically be read at face value in all cases. It may actually be a screen which probably allows us to not see and see at the same time something much more difficult and dangerous in the case of more sophisticated books. Yeah.
Saikat, waiting with bated breath for you, and we are willing to forego lunch for some time while we hear you.
I hope that it doesn't come to that. But thanks for being here, and I think this wonderful theme, which I think critiques but also gives storytelling a strange negative centrality. There's so many things that have come up. The first thing that comes to my mind listening to this is Benjamin's essay, The Storyteller, which I think many of you would know. And I think that's fascinating because the inevitable question that follows that essay is storytelling the same as novel writing? And of course there are differences, it's not. And I think these are questions we are always thinking about writing and writing about novels. And in many ways, I think the focal historical point where the transition happens in Western history is the Enlightenment, where earlier forms of storytelling, whether it's romance or epic or other performative forms, sort of become subsumed in some ways into the novel. And of course there are so many differences between the two. One of course is the question of originality, with sort of many of the audiences of the story knew there was no original story. It was a story taken from the folk tradition or communal memory, so there was no question of suspense. People already knew what the end was going to be. Of course this fetishization of the original idea also comes from this Enlightenment moment of modernity, that the idea of the original story, the idea of private reading, the idea of, and it's very interesting. I find it very fascinating because that's the moment where, say, something like the exotic adventure story turns into the story of the domestic. So the story of the ordinary life, the story of, and these are the kind of interesting transitions we see that that people there was a time when a story worth telling or worth listening would have to be about the alien, the kind of outlandish, the distant. Now with the novel, the question of verisimilitude, the work of Catherine Gallagher and are very interesting here, that people, it's important to learn about myself, the same surroundings, and the thing that is not, and this, this is the moment which, I in my book, Amit referred to kindly, Prose of the World, the centrality of the banal, that the banal becomes an engine of the story, as opposed to the exciting. This is also what ties to Tiffany's talk about the non-cathartic as a mark on the wall, or just walking around, a city, going through pubs. That those kind of things become subject of a story, if you can call it the story, whereas the traditional cathartic markers were kind of the big emotions. And for me, going to the question of Bengali culture and history, the big moment of this modernity is of course the Bengal Renaissance, and which is Bengal's engagement with the Enlightenment, engagement with both in the sense of social reform, social modernity, but crucially literary modernity, the birth of, and this has been, I recognize myself as a writer, a thinker, an intellectual, very much in the legacy of this Bengal Renaissance, very much a creature of Enlightenment modernity in my relationship with print, in my work with prose. I think people who work with poetry have a kind of a vibrant pre-modern life. There's also a modern life of poetry, but poetry and performance obviously has a vibrant non-modern life. But in a way, as somebody who works in prose, being kind of confined to this sort of liberal bourgeois modernity, which, and I think what has happened is, in a sense, I've started to feel a bit restless, and this is something which I spoke about in one of the past symposiums, with this modernity, with this sort of being contained by this culture of modernity. And this has really come from my identity as a novelist. My last novel, The Firebird, was a novel about the culture of theatre, and it kind of embodied performativity in a way, and I felt a certain kind of energy come from performative cultures, which I felt was exhausted in the modern liberal bourgeois modernity. And as I look around, I feel that this liberal modernity has also come to kind of a crisis. If you look at the elections since 2016, whether in the US, in Europe, in India, and there's a sense of restlessness I feel which comes to me as an artist, but which I also see as a kind of political manifestation. But also specifically as a Bengali, as somebody who reads Bengali literature, I feel in some ways the Bengali historiography is overpowered by this genealogy of modernity, that the culture of the Bhadralok, and our stories often start with Bankim Chandra and Tagore, and there is a vibrant pre-modern or non-modern literary as well as historical narrative, which I think is very important, but it is not accessible to us as immediately as this narrative is, whether it's that we all hear about the Charjapad or Mongol Kabbo, or, but somehow they never catch the kind of centrality of imagination. I mean, whether we are talking of even the sort of kind of crass populist imagination of the current Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee, who renames all metro station after these. And I think there's a sense of resentment that it's of course a kind of a self-hatred, because I see myself as a product of this bourgeois Bhadralok modernity, which is also tied to my identity as a prose writer and prose reader, and I'm, in a way, it's kind of almost an utopian desire to escape this sort of this wonderful prison house of modernity. And that is, I don't know if it's possible or whether, and this is, I think, in many ways, it's easy to create a binary of the story and the non-story between the modern and the non-modern, but I think that's not as simple as that. There were definitely traditions before modernity which negate the idea of, it would be the same kind of stupid binary to say that, oh, the West is about this kind of musing and this kind of sort of poetic, lyrical, a kind of intellectual rumination, whereas the non-West is all about telling stories. I think we can construct a similar kind of historical binary which would be as short-sighted. Because obviously when you come to, since I've been asked to speak about Bangla literature, when it comes to Bangla literature, there you see a great formlessness. There's a wonderful formlessness which I think really defines and holds it against, sort of the trajectories of Western literature. The very first thing you notice is the question of length. And this formlessness is actually quite true of many bhasha vernacle literatures across India, that often you have the novella, the prosperity of the novella, which Amit has also written about, that this indeterminate length. It's not the story, not the novel, but this kind of in-betweenness. And, it's... and even if you look at the novels, like Tagore's novels are very hybrid things. It would be probably imperfect to call them novels of ideas, but they are certainly not novels in the same sense Sharat Chandra's novels are, or Bankim Chandra's novels are. Or if you take a short story writer like Bonaful, who could write a very plot-driven story in a minute, and the next moment could be a completely strange and incomplete philosophical rumination with no characters. The next one could be a mythological tale. So this sort of amateur formlessness, and it's significant that he was actually a physician writing as an amateur, that this kind of sense of, I'm not doing this as a professional novelist, which is something you get someone like Sharat Chandra. Even someone like Bibhuti Bhushan, who is very much rooted in character and space. There is a certain kind of narration, but it's not teleological narration, but it doesn't build towards a certain climax. And I got thinking when Amit was talking about Ray, that I recently saw again actually Ray's film version of Pather Panchali, and the visual quality of the film just blew me away all over again. I'd seen it a long time back, and it's so incredibly powerful that I realized that I actually couldn't pay attention to the story. That there's something about the visual quality of the film which really distracts you from the story, where it doesn't matter. And this is exactly the quality I think he was talking about, that obviously with someone like Ritik Ghatak, I also saw Meghita Katara around the same time, and you can see that narrative quality. But and I think it's interesting because there is and this visual quality is not quite there in the same way in the second and third movies of the trilogy, which is Aparaj and Apu Shangshar. But certainly the first one, there is this. So it's very interesting that how this storytelling is repeatedly stalled, and this is exactly what I think throws the social scientific instinct into a kind of a chaos. Because what I think happens in the modern Indian project of knowledge creation is especially the post-independence project, is the great Nehruvian project of nation building, and of course sitting here in Delhi right here in IIC is the great place to talk about it. That in some ways overpowers all branches of knowledge making. That's a kind of the social and political conscience is driven by this nation building project. And I think I'm actually even specifically thinking of institutions like JNU, which was kind of embodies this great Nehruvian dream, and which was primarily a social science place, and the language and literature departments were really sort of marginal to this project. And I see this social science project as kind of emanating from this kind of Nehruvian project, that we must, and this is something I'm also very disturbed by, that we do judge novels. Of course, poems here are not judged at all because they don't thematize social concerns in the same way that they can be narrativized, but books are judged because they're on important subjects, when of course they should be about how they treat subjects, not about what they're about. And this, I think, has a special sort of rootedness in the Indian context because of this great Nehruvian project of nation building, which has become sort of shaped this entire epistemological project, which I think is a huge loss. And that's exactly the kind of thing, this critique of storytelling can throw into a kind of a disarray.
Great, that's wonderful. I just want to ask you one last question and then throw it open to the audience. You speak about your tiredness with the prison house of liberal bourgeois Bhadralok modernity. Now, this prison house was created at what time, and what are its key ideological texts? it seems to me that it's a hegemony without any key studies or key texts. We have a very vague idea of what this liberal bourgeois modernity is. If people had a kind of idea of the liberal bourgeois Bhadralok modernity in Bengal that they were rebelling against, it was the artists of that time who emerged into and from that modernity. The rebellion begins not as recently as you or your restlessness, but with Tagore. Tagore. So what is interesting in Tagore's time and with Tagore is, I think, that the prison house is not so much seen to be as colonialism as reconfigured as this Bhadra society which he's born into and which he's a misfit in. And very early on he begins to argue against that, the expectations of that Bhadra civil society, Bengali society. So of course he's politically also arguing against the English, against the British, arguing against also at the same time, as everybody knows that, conceptually against nationalism. But in his aesthetics, he is arguing against this liberal bourgeois modernity, of which we also associate with him. So elision and compression in his case are also arguments against a narrative built by liberal bourgeois modernity, as much as they might be expressions of that liberal bourgeois modernity. So the question is, what is this prison house? When did it begin? What do we know of it? We seem to know next to nothing about it. How does it become a prison?
Yeah, it's absolutely it's a prison because it's invisible, I guess, but it's everywhere. But I mean, it's a very simple thing, very simple conversation that when people would say, "Oh, Bengali culture, it's such a rich and ancient culture," I'm like, wow, it's obviously that notion of Bengali culture being ancient is a very, but what they mean is actually the culture somewhere beginning in the 19th century, early 19th century. And that is when you compare, even as Calcutta as a kind of a very colonial city, it's really, even if you look at Delhi, the architecture goes at least to the Middle Ages, or even before. If you look at something like the Qutub Minar, even before Puru-Mughal, or South Indian temple architecture or dance forms. I mean, I just feel like in Bengal we don't have anything that predates the colonial in this kind of significant way. I'm not saying this is a loss. I'm not saying, cultures are not measured in terms of their sort of historical longevity. They're measured in terms of their richness. And we've spoken about how the richness of Bengali culture is almost atemporal, that even in the short time. But that being said, it is almost agreed that much of what we inhabit and theorize and talk about as part of Bengali culture is a result of the encounter with colonial modernity. And again, I'm not a historian, and I think historians can say more about it, but we just don't hear enough about the pre-colonial past. It's almost like this modernity is what sort of makes us. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Tagore definitely critiques this in his relation. I mean, Tagore's background is also very interestingly feudal, which predates this kind of capitalist. To the Tagore family were the first professionals also, the Brahmo tradition or the kind of secular version of Hinduism. But at the same time, his pastoralism, his relationship with nature, there are moments at which he punctures it. But this is, this is something I mean, even in the popular imagination, I don't feel anything which sort of really predates the modern. It somehow keeps going back to the same founding figures. It goes back to the same, and even in the historiography, the historical attention, say the 19th century gets or the 20th century gets, I just don't see any kind of proportionate attention to even in the medieval.
I agree, but what's being posited against what predates the modern, that is the modern or the colonial modern, itself is presented in a language which needs looking at again. This idea, colonial encounter, modernity was produced, you had a Bhadralok class, and then they produced a literature. This is inadequate. It is much more complicated and richer than that. The argumentations that form that modernity and its occurrence. So what's being posited against the pre-modern, we have yet to find a language for that which formed us, because whether we are of it or rebel against it, it formed us. We have yet to find a language outside of this. Colonial modernity is, colonizers came along and then modernity happened. Otherwise, we would have maybe had an indigenous modernity. Maybe there are traces of indigenous modernity here and there. Those formulations are inadequate. I have absolutely no idea what this has to do with storytelling or against storytelling, but I think it does have something to do with it. Anyway, let us open this to the audience, and then people are getting hungry and have been very patient so far. Does somebody want to ask a question? Yeah.
I think all three of you have been noting down. For instance, you said while trying to define against storytelling, you used the phrase or the word non-silent, non-arrested flow. Uday too kept using non-narrative. Saikat, not teleological, or storytelling is repeatedly stalled. So I was wondering why we are kind of defining against storytelling in a vocabulary of lack. Formless, always plotless. So is it possible to have a critical vocabulary or critical discourse that comes from within against storytelling instead of borrowing it against, a vocabulary which presumes that plot is where it should be, or form and all.
A plenitude of plotlessness. Uday?
I think that's a great point. I mean, this shows to a degree our imprisonment into a dominant language. But in these situations, I'm in favor of turning the imprisonment into a kind of a rebellion. That this is, that for me, certainly the radical language. When I wrote, Prose of the World, my sense was, this is where it's very close to Tiffany's project. I use words like marginal, banal, and these themselves are very value-laden words. And she also talks about, incomplete. And these are, in some senses, the incomplete, of course, posits the complete as the other. The banal posits the important. The boring posits the, exciting, or the waiting posits fulfillment. But I think it's an ongoing project, but the way I think of it is that it's a bit like the word Dalit, I guess. Not to push up political point too much, but that's also a disempowered diction, but one that has been turned into something powerful, a gesture of rebellion. And that's something that was certainly my aesthetic project when I was turning this sort of marginal words, where the margin becomes a kind of a thing, because it's very act of being foregrounded is a radical act, and that is what is happening in this against storytelling project. But others may have.
Yeah, very quickly. Actually, when I saw the title against storytelling, I read it as a kind of a provocative title, and not, provocative phrases do not mean what they literally say, and they are a form of action in the sense that they want to make you think in certain ways. So I don't think it's a question of being for or against storytelling. It is rather a question of seeing what is it that actually happens. In this particular discussion, we have focused on texts which announce themselves as stories, and we were trying to show that maybe if we describe what's actually happening, we may have to kind of set aside a lot of things which we see as the protocols of narration. And that, I think, is a much more, perhaps there may be concepts which come out of that, but I'm not sure that there would actually be concepts which would form a kind of coherent constellation which you can juxtapose with narrative theory, because what is involved is describing cultural practices of various kinds which go under this sign or alibi of storytelling. Yeah.
Great. Sambuddha? Maybe the last question, unless somebody else also had a question, in which case we can take two questions together. But if not, then this is the last question. Yeah.
This is a question for Uday. Uday, I was very interested in the distinction you make between writing and narrative in the Dalit autobiography.
Right.
So one of the things you are saying is that the narrative rightly is oriented towards point of completion, and in that sense, teleologically, oriented towards, you could call it self-formation. On the other hand, you are talking about these moments of interruption and complex moments of interaction that are sometimes even, that hover at the edge of writing itself. Your example of humiliation as experience where you want to climb out of yourself, but at the same time experience yourself at its most, in its most intense way. Now, writing is also a way of shaping that experience, isn't it?
Yes.
And to that extent, an aspect of self-formation, irrespective of whether it is aligned to the narrative trajectory. And would then that distinction become less sharp than what you're suggesting?
Yeah. No, you're right in one sense. Part of the problem is also that we work with, when we make arguments like this, we are working with two different ideas of narrative. One is the idea that narrative is a rather simple structure which we can understand in terms of plot, progress, like the Bildungsroman, for example, is about self-formation, etc., etc. The other is the idea of narrative as a much more complex idea. Like what we call self-formation itself does not really mean that everything which goes into the formation is appropriated or assimilated. What you have is actually a kind of synchronic structure where things are not fully in place and things may actually be exerting pressure of unfinished business of various kinds. If we take that second kind of approach, of course the distinction becomes less important. But the distinction is really between these two ways of viewing narrative itself. Then one last small point, and then we'll stop. The question of humiliation is also important because of the proximity of the effect to shame, which is also performed in the reading activity of these texts. So as you are reading the text, there is also a kind of demand or a kind of performance which happens in the space of reading, which is one of exposure which you want to turn away from, like questions of embarrassment, where you want to turn away from something, but at the same time, something which draws you to that. That work again is something which is not appropriated or completed by the overall working of the plot. That's what I would say.
Wonderful. I had wanted to ask a question of Tiffany and of you, but we have no time. But I will say that, Tiffany had said earlier that I'm not so interested in stories. So it was a relief for me, some such word, when you read the concept note. I was more interested in reading poetry and criticism. And we haven't touched upon criticism, though we are. What is it that criticism offers if it doesn't offer a story? Is it only knowledge, or what else? What does it offer? Anyway, it has been more interesting to listen to you than to listen to stories of various kinds being told by storytellers today. So thank you so much for coming here and giving us your insights. Thank you.